On the morning of September 14th, 2014, a convoy of 12 heavy-duty flatbed trucks rumbled through the dense, fog-laden forests of the Pacific Northwest, navigating a narrow, unpaved logging road just outside the boundaries of Olympic National Park. The lead vehicle carried a massive, hydraulic-tracked excavator weighing more than 40 tons, its steel treads grinding against the damp earth with an ominous, mechanical rhythm. This industrial procession was moving toward a highly restricted zone along the upper reaches of the Elwha River, a waterway that had remained largely undisturbed by such heavy machinery for decades. Deep within the locked containers trailing behind the convoy lay a cargo so heavy, so seemingly mundane, that the local rangers questioned the entire operation. No one outside a tight circle of federal engineers knew exactly what these flatbeds were transporting. What mysterious cargo was about to be unleashed into the water, or what catastrophic event they were attempting to prevent. What transpired over the subsequent months would defy every established model of river engineering and ecology. It was an event that absolutely nobody predicted, a radical intervention that completely stunned the scientific community, leaving veteran researchers questioning everything they knew about hydrological restoration. Years later, scientists still discuss the profound, unprecedented implications of what occurred in that isolated valley. My name is Marcus Vance, and this is the full arc of the Great River Restoration. By the conclusion of this account, you will understand how the simple geometric placement of inert material can reverse a century of environmental decay. You will discover the hidden biological mechanism that connects alpine forests to the depths of the Pacific Ocean. And finally, you will see how a single, desperate gamble by a small team of overlooked biologists redefined our relationship with the natural world forever. But to understand the transformation of the Elwha River, you have to start with something unexpected: the microscopic composition of ancient volcanic river sediment. For millennia, the health of this entire watershed depended entirely on the precise size, shape, and distribution of gravel and rock tumbling down from the Olympic Mountains. When a mountain river flows naturally, it carries fine silt, coarse sand, cobble, and massive boulders, sorting them across the landscape in a complex geological dance. This sorting process creates what hydrologists refer to as interstitial spaces, the microscopic gaps between stones where water flows slower, cooler, and with higher concentrations of dissolved oxygen. According to a landmark study published in the Journal of Hydrological Processes in 2003, these subsurface flows are the literal circulatory system of the river, filtering toxins and regulating temperatures across entire valleys. Without this precise gravel matrix, a river loses its structural integrity and its capacity to sustain life. In a healthy river ecosystem, the ultimate beneficiary of this geological sorting is the wild Pacific salmon, an animal widely recognized by biologists as a premier keystone species and a critical ecosystem engineer. These fish do not merely inhabit the river, they actively sculpt it. When a female salmon returns from the ocean to spawn, she uses her tail to excavate a depression in the riverbed, a nest known as a redd. In doing so, she cleans the gravel, flushing out fine sediments that would otherwise smother her eggs. This act of biological engineering alters the local hydraulics of the riverbed, creating localized zones of upwelling that benefit countless aquatic insects and microorganisms. A subsequent paper in the journal Ecology Letters in 2009 demonstrated that the physical presence of salmon redds stabilized river gravels during winter floods, preventing catastrophic erosion downstream. For thousands of years, millions of salmon return to the Elwha River annually, carrying millions of pounds of marine-derived nutrients from the ocean directly into the heart of the old-growth forest. It was a flawless, self-sustaining loop of energy and biology. But that is not what happened to the Elwha River in the 20th century. In the early 1900s, human ambition disrupted this ancient loop. Two massive hydroelectric dams were constructed across the Elwha River without fish passage facilities, effectively severing the connection between the mountains and the sea. The impact was immediate and devastating. The salmon were blocked from reaching their historic spawning grounds, confined to the final 5 miles of the river below the lower dam. Deprived of the marine-derived nutrients provided by the dying salmon, the entire ecosystem began to starve. The trees grew slower, the bald eagle populations dwindled, and the river itself began to change. Because the dams trapped all the gravel and sediment in reservoirs upstream, the river below the dams became starved of rock. The rushing water eroded the remaining gravel, leaving behind nothing but bare, sterile bedrock and giant boulders too large for any fish to move. The intricate interstitial spaces vanished, and with them, the insect populations that formed the baseline of the aquatic food web. The river had become an aquatic desert, loud on the surface, but dead underneath. For nearly a century, conservationists and tribal leaders fought for the removal of these obstructions, a monumental battle that culminated in the largest dam removal project in human history, which began in 2011. Scientists celebrated, believing that once the concrete walls were gone, nature would instantly heal itself. The river would flush out the accumulated reservoir sediment, the gravel would return, and the salmon would reclaim their ancestral home. What they found next changed everything. Instead of a rapid ecological rebirth, the sudden release of millions of cubic yards of trapped sediment created a new, unforeseen crisis. The river became choked with an overwhelming volume of fine, suffocating silt. The water turned the color of chocolate milk, blocking out all sunlight and dropping dissolved oxygen levels to near zero. The remaining salmon that attempted to enter the river were blinded and choked by the suspended solids. The newly freed river began to migrate unpredictably across the floodplain, tearing through old-growth forests and carving out unstable, volatile channels that shifted with every minor rainfall. The gravel did not settle into stable beds. Instead, it washed straight out into the ocean, leaving the river channels raw, fragmented, and completely hostile to any biological life. Researchers who had spent decades anticipating this moment watched in horror as the river threatened to become a permanent wasteland. The salmon were not coming back. In fact, the remaining hatchery stocks were on the verge of total collapse. Nobody expected what came after this initial failure. The scientific team realized that the river lacked the structural framework to heal itself. It was moving too fast, carrying too much fine sediment, and lacked the stable structures required to slow the water down and trap the larger gravels needed for spawning. They needed a solution that could immediately stabilize the river channels without relying on traditional, permanent concrete structures that would further damage the environment. They needed to mimic nature, but at a massive, industrialized scale. The engineering team proposed a highly controversial, untested plan. They would manually deposit 6,000 tons of specific, angular basalt rocks directly into the churning torrent of the river. These were not ordinary rocks. They were precisely selected and graded stones, ranging from 12 to 36 inches in diameter, designed to lock together under the immense pressure of the river current. The goal was to construct a series of temporary, engineered log jams and rock structures that would force the river to slow down, drop its heavy sediment load, and create stable pools. Many experts ridiculed the plan, arguing that the river would simply sweep the 6,000 tons of rock away during the first winter flood, wasting millions of dollars and potentially exacerbating the downstream flooding. The stakes were incredibly high, and the team was operating on a razor-thin timeline. And here is where the story turns on a piece of pure luck. While geomorphologists were mapping the upper valleys to find the optimal placement for these 6,000 tons of rock, they discovered an anomaly in an old, forgotten territorial survey map from 1889. The map, hand-drawn by an early explorer, noted an unusual series of deep, stable limestone depressions and terraced stone pools in a remote upstream valley that had long been overlooked. When a small team of biologists hiked into this coordinates, they found something extraordinary. It was the historical site of an ancient woodland bison wallow, a place where a rogue prehistoric herd of wood bison had once migrated through the mountains centuries ago. The heavy trampling of these massive animals had compacted the river clay and forced large river boulders into a unique, terraced staircase configuration that had survived for hundreds of years, long after the bison themselves had vanished from the region. This ancient biological disturbance had created a perfect, natural sediment trap that had kept that specific upper tributary crystal clear and incredibly stable, even during the worst floods. Yet, the mystery of the bison wallows only deepened when researchers realized the animals had left behind something far more consequential than simple tracks, raising a question that no one was prepared to answer. This historical discovery provided the engineers with the exact structural blueprint they needed. Nature had already solved the problem using the heavy, compacted geometry of the Earth. The engineers realized they did not need to build artificial walls. They needed to replicate the terraced, interlocking structures found at the ancient bison site. This realization added a profound emotional dimension to the project, connecting the modern engineering effort to a deep, forgotten history of ancestral wildlife and ecological memory. The project was no longer just about saving a fish species. It was about restoring a broken timeline of a continent. However, the team faced a formidable antagonist in the form of bureaucratic inertia and intense political opposition from downstream industrial interests. Local water treatment facilities and logging corporations feared that altering the river's flow with 6,000 tons of rock would redirect the floodwaters into their infrastructure, causing millions of dollars in property damage. They filed injunctions demanding the immediate cessation of the project. The engineers were forced to operate under the constant threat of legal shutdown, knowing that if they did not place the rock before the arrival of the autumn rains, the window of opportunity would close forever, and the remaining salmon run would perish. The team worked around the clock, mapping the river currents with advanced sonar and dropping the massive basalt boulders with surgical precision from heavy cranes and specialized helicopters. Each rock had to be placed at a specific angle relative to the flow to ensure that the river's own energy would compress the structure, making it stronger over time rather than destroying it. It was a terrifying game of hydraulic chess against a powerful, unpredictable opponent. But the biggest surprise was still to come. As the final truckloads of the 6,000 tons of rock were placed into the Elwha River, the autumn monsoons arrived with a vengeance. The river swelled to 10 times its normal volume, turning into a roaring, terrifying wall of white water that shook the very ground. The scientists and engineers could only watch from the high ridges, unable to see beneath the muddy, churning surface. They feared the worst. They feared that their engineered rock terraces would be obliterated, turning into 6,000 tons of destructive projectiles that would wipe out the remaining downstream habitats. For 3 weeks the storm raged and the river remained inaccessible. When the floodwaters finally receded and the river cleared, the research team hiked down to the channel, expecting to see a scene of total devastation. What they witnessed instead left them completely, utterly speechless. The 6,000 tons of rock had not washed away. Instead, exactly as the ancient bison structures had done centuries before, the basalt boulders had locked together under the immense pressure of the flood, forming a series of magnificent, self-stabilizing natural terraces. The transformation was breathtaking. The roaring, destructive torrent had been tamed into a beautiful, complex labyrinth of slow-moving pools and gentle riffles. The heavy, suffocating silt that had choked the river for years had been trapped behind the rock structures, allowing the river to naturally sort the pristine, coarse, spawning gravel over the top. The water had turned from a thick, muddy brown to a brilliant, crystal-clear turquoise, filtered through the newly formed stone matrices. The silence of the dead river valley was suddenly broken by a sound that had not been heard in its fullness for over 100 years. It was the sound of splashing water, heavy and rhythmic. When the biologists looked into the newly formed pools, they saw thousands of massive silver shapes cutting through the clear current. The wild Chinook salmon had returned. Driven by an ancient, indestructible instinct, the fish had navigated through the newly opened river channels, found the pristine gravel beds created by the rock structures, and begun to spawn. The scale of the return was unprecedented. In a matter of weeks, over 4,000 adult salmon were counted in sections of the river that had been completely devoid of life for a century. The fish were massive, some weighing over 40 pounds, their bodies shifting from ocean silver to deep, vibrant crimson as they prepared to lay their eggs. The biological chain reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. The millions of eggs deposited in the clean gravel provided an immediate feast for aquatic insects, whose populations exploded within months. The carcasses of the salmon that died after spawning were dragged into the forest by bears, eagles, and otters, distributing vital marine nitrogen to the surrounding flora. Tree ring samples taken just 2 years later showed a dramatic, measurable increase in growth rates along the riverbanks. The eagles returned to the canopy, their cries echoing through the canyon once more. The river was no longer an empty, broken conduit of water. It was a living, breathing, dynamic entity that had been brought back from the edge of the grave by the simple, calculated placement of stone. We often operate under the profound misconception that our relationship with the natural world must always be one of extraction or absolute isolation. We believe that we can either destroy a landscape or leave it entirely alone, forgetting that we possess the unique capacity to act as conscious participants in its healing. This river reminds us that the scars we inflict upon the earth can be healed not by walking away, but by stepping forward with humility, using our intellect to echo the ancient wisdom of the structures that came before us. The stone we place today becomes the bedrock upon which the future builds its memory. What are your thoughts on this extraordinary ecological resurrection and the unexpected ways that history and engineering converged to save this wild river? If you found value in this story of transformation and legacy, please consider subscribing to the channel to support our ongoing exploration of the natural world. My name is Marcus Vance, and thank you for listening.